it's Lisa. In this series we're going to be creating several cards using our regular paper crafting supplies, our stamps, our papers, and ribbons, and etc. But we're going to change up the color a little bit. Instead of using ink or mists or other things that we traditionally use, we're going to use watercolors. Now I'm just working with a regular cheap watercolor set that I bought at Hobby Lobby. I think this was maybe a $20 set several years ago. I undoubtedly bought it with a coupon back when they had those. All the craft stores have some type of watercolor set, or you can order them online. And somewhere between $15 and $40 you can buy a set of watercolors and have all the wonderful colors that you will need. If you want to work with tube paint watercolors and you have those already, that's great. The reason that I'm doing this is I've been kind of migrating over to watercolors more for the last few months. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm doing more and more sewing and other things in my craft space, and I need the space. I have a confession. I love color, and I'm a big sucker for anything that comes in a rainbow of colors. So I have tons of Stampin' Up! Inks, distress inks, markers of different kinds, colored pencils, watercolor crayons, gelatos. You get the idea. Lots and lots of things. And all those things take up room. And I needed the space. So I started thinking, a couple of years ago I realized that if I knew what I knew now, I would probably just invest more in something like watercolors rather than all these different things that some of them are versatile and some of them are not. And I wouldn't have so many different items, but I have them. And so I have to decide what I want to keep and what I want to move out of my space. And recently I started doing more and more with watercolors, and I actually have moved out quite a large collection of ink pads in favor of watercolors and other things that I have. So I want to show you some ways of using watercolors for traditional scrapbooking techniques or paper crafting techniques like coloring in a stamped image, and for doing some things that are fun and unique in some ways to watercolors. So we're going to do several cards over the series. I've also picked papers that are available anywhere. Strathmore watercolor paper. There are papers that are considered better for watercolors. Oh, and I do want to say this. I'm approaching the video as a card maker using watercolors as a medium, as opposed to a watercolor artist making cards. That's a very different thing. There are some wonderful videos out there, and I've started following some of them. Some I've been successful with, some I haven't, of creating beautiful cards using watercolors. But that's not what, that's painting, and that's a different approach than what we're going to take. Now, the paper that I've chosen is available to pretty much anywhere. The Strathmore watercolor paper. This is cold press. It's 140-pound paper. You want something, for most of these techniques, you want something that's at least 140 pounds. If it's lighter than that, it's going to really curl a lot. And we're going to do these kind of the quick and easy way, and you'll learn more about that as we go along. Again, approaching this as a card maker, not as a watercolor artist. So Strathmore watercolor paper happens to be what I'm using. If you have other watercolor paper, you can certainly work with that too. I'm also going to do some things with mixed media paper from Strathmore. I'm just about out. This is like all I have left. And after doing the cards, this is what I've got left in mixed media paper. But it's a really, what I like about it, watercolor paper has a texture to the surface. And mixed media paper, let's see, what do I have here? This one's mixed media. I don't have much watercolor paper left either. But the watercolor paper of this kind, the watercolor paper has quite a bit of texture to it, and it's probably not going to show up on the screen. But if you've worked with it before, you're familiar with the texture. There's a right side and what's considered a wrong side. Most of the time for what we're doing, it's not going to matter. But when you pull it out of the pad, what's up, it's the right side. And then the mixed media paper has a real smooth texture. And some of the things we're doing, I think, look better on the mixed media paper. Especially when you're working with stamps, because it's a smoother surface, it's just going to stamp better. But we'll talk about that as we go along and what will make it easier to get a good stamped image on the watercolor papers. So you need some type of heavier paper to use for these techniques. You need some set of watercolors. The first set of watercolors I had was like 8 colors. It was just a really cheap set, and I could do things with that too. So it doesn't have to be an expensive set. You'll need water, of course, and a couple of brushes. Now I have several brushes out here. It doesn't matter what kind, other than it's good if they're round brushes with a nice tip to them, especially in a smaller brush. When we start to do some coloring, it's going to be nice to have a little bit smaller brush. This is a size 2, so a 2, 3, even a 4 would probably work for the coloring techniques. This is a size 4. And then one of the larger brushes, I think I use the 8 a lot in these videos, and maybe the 10 some, but if you had a 2 and an 8, that's plenty to do everything that we're going to do here. An optional item would be to have some kind of white plate. This could be a styrofoam plate. This can be a ceramic plate. I bought this at the dollar store. What you would do then is to mix some of your colors. If you want to like take this, the red and orange, and mix them together to get a little bit different shade, you could do that inside the plate. And some of your watercolor palettes will have a tray to them where you can do the mixing there. That's not something that's necessary here either. You can work directly, and I do work directly from the palette most of the time, but it's just a nice little extra thing. And then you just need stamps, your regular, normal paper crafting supplies. So the only thing that's really extra is a heavier paper, some type of round brush with a good point to it, and your watercolors. You'll also want some paper towels on hand. That's really all. It's not a really messy thing. You'll see every once in a while in the videos I'll have spread out something on my surface because I might be doing some splattering and things. But you don't really need a whole lot of that to do these cards. So I have several cards for you in several different videos, and I hope you will enjoy this process as we go through it. I enjoyed making them. It's a lot of fun, and I got a lot of really pretty cards at the end. So let's get started. In the first video in our series, we're starting with some things that make watercolors kind of a unique thing. We're going to be creating these 2 cards, and there are things that you could do here with other medium, but they look really, really good with watercolors in the way that these cards are approached. And typical stamp sets, regular paper, other than the watercolor paper in this one and the mixed media paper for this one, and the watercolors themselves. Our next card is one of my favorites. This uses Stampin' Up's beautifully braided set, which is discontinued, but you could use any kind of an open leaf set. And we're going to be stamping this with brown archival ink, again, as long as it's a waterproof ink, in 2 places. And then I'm going to add some green watercolor paint here, sort of somewhat coloring in the leaves, and then just expanding that green and adding some splatters and things to make it a really beautiful card. I want to leave enough space between these to put my image or my words in the middle there. The watercolor paper, this is Strathmore watercolor paper, and it's cut to 4 by 5.5 inches. So let's get started with this. First of all, let me get my stamp press over here. I'm using the one from Tim Holtz, but you could use any type of stamp press. And I discovered that it's really important to not have anything under it. I had some paper towels under it, and it was actually throwing off the way it was stamping. So I think it'll be back to normal now. Alright, I'm going to position my watercolor paper. I'll just kind of look and see. No, it needs to go over a little bit. It is important that I have it on this press because of stamping on the watercolor paper. Many times you have to stamp multiple times. Bring that down a little bit. I think that'll be good. Alright. So, and this ink pad, I don't have a refill for. It needs one, but I don't have one today. So let's see if we can get enough brown ink out of it to do one more card. Okay, that's better, but I've not quite got this last one up here inked. Add a little bit more. Go back over it, and I have happy with that. All right, so we're going to flip it over to do the other corner. And probably bring it up just a little bit. Right there. Once again, I didn't get the backing in. Okay, that's better. Now, as I say, my ink pad is a little dry, so I'm getting kind of the best I can with the circumstances I have. Okay. Now for my card, I also stamped a piece of paper to go on the inside, and I used Distress Antique Linen on just plain white, this is like copy paper, card paper for the inside. Okay. Now, what I want for this is some green inks. I've got a couple of different shades that I'm going to work with here, and I've mixed the two of them together on my palette as well, and that's gotten a little dry, so add a little bit of water to it. And I'm going to start actually with the more olivey one. Ooh, that's way too much water. And all I want to do is just add a little bit to the middle of each one. And this is one of those, you can't really do it wrong. Just sort of do what looks good to you. And it's very casual look. It's going to go outside the lines, and that's what we want. And I'm going to add a little bit of the other green. And I'm going to take some of what I have mixed together here, and then I'm just going to start kind of spreading this around, keeping it dark on the leaves themselves. And we're going to add some water and kind of pull that color out. You don't want your brush too wet, just kind of lightly wet. And we're just going to start pulling it out to the edges, kind of casually. I'm working with my size 8 brush. Any larger brush would work for this. Wouldn't even have to be a round brush necessarily. Just a little bit in there. Getting a little too green. And I'm trying to leave a little bit of white, not completely covering this in all green. And I want it to show a little bit of darker color still in these. Not too much there. Now this is one of those cards where you could tape the edges of the paper down to keep it from curling. It's just not going to be a real problem. We're going to dry it here in a minute, and that will help deal with that issue. Alright, I'm going to get some of this green spread out. I'm going out a little bit, very light out the edges. Again, leaving at least some white in between each one of the leaves, so it's not totally covered. I love how this is coming out. See, it's gotten a little bit darker in places here, and you really can kind of see the watercolor effect. And that's what you want. It's part of the purpose of doing watercolors. In some of the cards where we're coloring an image in, we don't necessarily want it. We're just using watercolors as any other type of paint to paint in an image. In this case, I want that watercolory look. That's part of the purpose of using watercolors versus using distress inks or other kinds of inks. Now, I think that's really pretty as it is, but I could also add the splatters. So to add the splatters, of course, I would take the paint and then I would use my finger or another brush and it would create the droplets. In this case, I really like this one without the splatters, so I think I'm going to leave it without. So I have one with the splatters and one without the splatters. This one's also going to be more of a sympathy card. I'm going to change the greeting that I use and do a thinking of you greeting. So once this dries good, then I'll add that greeting with my archival ink. Okay, so here's the completed card. And when I stamped this greeting, everything was dry. So since my ink pad, my archival ink pad's a little bit dry too, I went ahead and used some distress ink that I knew was in good shape and stamped over it. As long as you're not going to add more water, then it's fine to use one of these water-based inks because I'm done with the card. If everything's dry, I can go over that with regular ink pads. And I really love the look. Yesterday I created this one and it was my favorite, and today this one's become my favorite. You can't create the same look twice, even if you want to. So I've got just a very different arrangement of the greens, and there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences, and I think they're both beautiful cards. And I'll just want to make sure I don't send them to the same person for different occasions. And I've got a lovely image that works for multiple things. So it's just another example of how you can use watercolors. This happy birthday card has a splattery kind of background. And we're going to do two different techniques to get the look here. So I'm going to be applying some color to my craft mat. If you didn't have a craft mat, you should be able to do this with something like wax paper. I've done that in the past with other things. I didn't try it for this technique. But these craft mats you can get at the craft stores like Michael's and all, and I think Ranger makes them, and they're just wonderful because they're heat resistant. You can do a lot of stuff with them. This is my original one. I cut it one time with one of my cutters. Yeah, that does happen, but it's pretty durable otherwise, and I bought another one, and then I ended up using it for a different purpose. It was unrelated to the craft, so I back to this old one. It's in pretty rough shape after being used for so many years, but you just need that slick surface to put your paints on. I'm going to start with the orange. You will need a heat gun handy because you will need to dry between or either let it dry as you go. So let's start with some orange. I'm using mixed media paper. I'm going to get a pretty juicy application here of watercolors. This is the kind of technique you've probably seen with distress inks and all kinds of things, but it works great with watercolors. Just now you can leave it like this so it looks really splashed on, or you can kind of smooth some of it out if you want to make the color flatter. It's really whatever you want in terms of appearance. Now, you need to clean your surface. You can already see it's getting a different effect than what I had here. I had my colors a little closer together, and here I've spread them out a little bit more. You can get some very different looks. Now we're going to let this dry, and we're going to do one last thing with the gold. Okay, I want to create a splatter, but I want my splatter to sort of radiate out. And this is where you need to have some space, because you're going to make a little bit of a mess doing this kind of technique. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to load it up good with gold paint, probably off camera. Right? And then I'm just going to run it through my hands. And what it's doing is it's creating a splatter. And I need just a smidge more. Hopefully you can see that it has sent some splatters out from the side. If I hadn't gotten so much gold everywhere, it would show up a little bit more. You can see it a little more on this one because I left more white space in the background. Just a different look. But it looks like the gold is kind of coming out from the center. Now, other ways that you can create splatter effects, let's say I wanted some splatters of the orange. So I take the orange and you just tap. And that creates an effect as well. Now, all of this needs to dry really, really good before we stamp on it. Okay, this one's a really splattery effect. So I'm going to add this happy birthday stamp. You could put a design on a separate piece of paper on top of this. You could do any kind of bold image like this. I think doing this in black will really set it off. So I'm going to use the archival ink, another ink pad that I just re-inked recently. So hopefully we'll get a very good image, because since this is a wood block, unless I get my Stamp-A-Majig out, this is kind of a one-shot deal here. Okay, that came out good. And this one I trimmed it down a little bit differently, but I could add a mat and put it on a card. You could add some enamel dots to it. I could run a ribbon around it, a lot of different things. So that gives me another kind of interesting background design that uses some of those fun, splashy kind of techniques. So in this video we've seen ways to use watercolors along with our stamps and some interesting techniques with them. Maybe a little splatter, maybe a little not, but it really showcases what watercolors can do. Thanks for joining me today.